Welcome back to Check the System Design. You are watching the second part of CodeSandbox System Design. If you haven't watched the first part, would highly recommend to go and watch it first. But don't forget to come back for learning the tech side of the CodeSandbox. Before we move ahead, just say Check the System Design and subscribe the channel for the upcoming awesome content. Let's quickly have a glimpses of the episode first. We are conducting mock interview with Muskein. He is a senior software engineer at Microsoft, and we have covered functional and the non-functional requirement of a code sandbox. Like in functional requirement, we need template in order to get started. We need online editor, or you can say the ID, and it should have certain capabilities. Like there can be some extension, there can be code suggestion, highlighting, and a terminal where you can like operate something, right? So we need real-time preview so that anything we are making a change in the code editor, that should be visible on your right hand side in order to have a preview. A file explorer where you can have lot of support in terms of multi-file support. Files and folder can be created, deleted, and renamed. We can move it. There can be some shortcuts to achieve that, and debugging capabilities in the code preview. Yeah, so in the non-functional requirement, your application as in code sandbox and the application which is generated, that should be performant enough. It should have a real-time preview so that maybe you don't have to save to the server. You can use some client-side techniques in order to have a real-time preview. You need UI enhancement like theming support. You can make a ID basically similar to your local ID, where you can change the theme and work in as a better developer experience. Like some deployment strategies where you have to plan like what are the different platform you can deploy at just a click away. And in this episode we are going to dive more on the tech side of the code sandbox, so keep watching till the end. There are so many surprises and the learning waiting for you. Okay, so Muskin, we have already covered a lot of functional and non-functional requirement, that too in very detail. So I think it's time to get into the tech side of thing. So yeah, let's get started.
Okay, sure. So I'll try to break down the tech choices into the parts that we have discussed in the functional and non-functional requirements. What all choices will I make for things like, let's say, file explorer, live editor, and things like that. So let's say one by one, if I try to cover for the code editor part, what I think that I would do is I would not go and implement something of my own right away, because there must be and there are libraries that I know that exists that give out these capabilities out of the box. Bunch of them that I know that VS Code also internally uses, and like things like CodePen also uses, are things like Monaco and CodeMirror. Although I've not used them personally, I know they're very famous libraries that kind of exist that give wrappers on top of traditional JavaScript as well as React and bunch of other support to other libraries and languages as well.
Mhm.
So my tech choice for the front end part of code editor would be to use an existing library. So I'm going to write that down. Use an existing library like, let's say, Monaco or Code Mirror,
Mhm.
right? And for me, I am very comfortable using React for this, and I think it's a very good use case
Mhm.
to use React for all the front end things that we do, building the file explorer and everything. So I'll use React for the entire, uh, uh, building of the entire UI for that. So
Do you
React
see any
specifically.
limitation? Yeah. Do you see any limitation if you are like someone want to use it with any other library or the framework?
Yes, yes. I mean, there are limitations as such that but at the end of the day, what I'm giving them a console which will
Mhm.
eventually get rendered in JavaScript, right? It's not like my console is acting as a library to someone else,
Mhm.
right? Which means that it's not like I'm publishing a library. When I'm publishing a library, I'll try to support as many different frameworks and different libraries as possible.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, my React will get compiled into transpile into JavaScript, right? And in the end, flow down as a typical HTML browser or whatever way I choose to do that, right? So that should not be a problem. But let's say onboarding new people, onboarding new people to write code for the editor, if they're
Mhm.
not good with React, that is a challenge that I see. But because React has become so famous in terms of contribution, in terms of libraries,
Mhm.
in terms of community and support that it has, I think it should not be that much of a problem. So it's a fair, good uh, choice, in my opinion, for a
Sure.
tech stack at this
Sure.
point. Right. Cool. So that is the thing that I would pick up. I would pick React because I am kind of familiar with that,
Mhm.
and I'll pick something like Monaco and CodeMirror to do the code editor part. When it comes to doing things like real time, this is where things get a little, I think, challenging. So let's think when we have to do real time, right? I am making a change, so I'm definitely hooking on to browser APIs,
Mhm.
right? To detect, let's say, keyboard control S or things like that, the menus that I'm creating. So I'm definitely hooking on the browser API, which is fine.
Mhm.
But I am also trying to save a lot of data, right, for the sandbox. So here is the thing: real-time preview. If I end up doing on a remote machine, on the machine
Mhm.
that I'm working on, I do not get complete access.
Mhm.
That is point number one. The second is if I go to a server and do it and report back, that is not going to be as fast. So it will not act as real time,
Mhm.
right? The third is that I will need a lot of storage. I will need a lot of ways to store this kind of data.
Mhm.
So it is a tricky problem in my opinion, and I will go with, if I have to do real time, I will kind of use, and also there's one more problem of using multiple languages support, right? So let's
Mhm.
say you have React, you have, sorry, TypeScript, JavaScript, you have, let's say tomorrow you support Vue, tomorrow you support JSON, Svelte, hundreds of
Mhm.
other things, right?
Yeah.
So your code editor code of compiling that piece of sandbox that you write will become very tricky, right?
Mhm.
And you should not ideally be doing that on the main thread,
Mhm.
because you are trying to complicate things. You're doing too many things on the main thread. So I will definitely involve a worker out here,
Mhm.
right? Because it's a complex operation,
Mhm.
right? Of trying to do things on top of a language. Let's say TypeScript becoming JavaScript. What is the compiled thing that it becomes, source code or compiled code that it becomes? So I'll do that over a worker. And when I do that over a worker, I will also have worker demarcation, or what do you say, worker per language
Mhm.
sort of scenario, right? That I will have a different worker for TypeScript. I will have a different type worker for Svelte. I will detect what language the user is writing on the sandbox, and depending on that, I'll run that worker,
Got it.
right?
Mhm. Makes
And
sense.
then let's say what I'll also do is, because there is a separate environment that is continuously reloading and doing things, right?
Mhm.
While I'm making changes here, it has to be, and because of the things that you might end up doing in the code, I
Mhm.
do not want it to impact my code sandbox at all. So because I want it to be a real sandbox of sorts, I will do an iframe, right? I
Got
will
it.
put that piece of code in an iframe,
Mhm.
run it, and whatever you do impacts the iframe, not my codesandbox.com or .io, whatever I end
Mhm.
up writing, right? So it's an iframe, and I will have a cross communication in between, right? Between the iframe and the parent, in a way.
Got it.
So that
Can
is
we
there.
draw something in so that we can have some visualization out of these? Because we have talked about so many things and it is very difficult to see where the web worker will
Hmm.
come into the picture, where we are going to
Sure,
use
sure, sure.
the sort of thing.
Right. Sure. So let's say this is my sandbox window, right? And typical sandbox looks like, okay, this is where you write your code. Imagine your file explorer is somewhere here, right? And this is where your preview system sort of lies,
Mhm.
right? I'm going to write preview out here. This is where the preview lies,
Mhm.
right? Now this is an iframe,
Okay.
right? And this is the complete parent. Now there'll obviously be continuous talk between these two,
Mhm.
right? And vice versa as well. Let's say you can talk uh, from that side. Let me see. Yeah, yeah. So there'll be cross communication between these two, right? Now, whatever you are doing out here, let's say you end up writing your code in JS, TS, Svelte,
Mhm.
right? For example.
Yeah.
Um, okay. Right now, I want to introduce a worker. So that worker generally resides in the browser scope, not at a domain scope, right? It's not something that you host. The browser will give you that separate thread, separate environment, separate worker for you to do things.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say that lives outside here somewhere. This is where your web worker for doing for expensive.
Okay, so the expensive
Operation.
thing, when you say it's more about you wanted to share the heavy loading of your editor and some compilation that you're doing on the web worker. That's what you meant by, right?
Yeah. I wouldn't do it on the main thread because it'll be like choking the main thread with a lot of things that are already happening, right? I am doing, let's say, things like I don't know. I'm actually thinking when I make changes to the UI, right? When I press save, it auto formats and things like that, adding extensions, multiple clicks here and there. Those are the things that can happen on the main thread. But this part of thing where I'm trying to transpile my TypeScript into JavaScript or Svelte into typical JavaScript or HTML at the end of the day, whatever, right? That all needs to happen in a web worker to make sure my main thread does not get choked.
Got it.
Right. So this is where this will talk to the web worker, and web worker will report back, or you can talk back to it to get the information that you have. Right.
Yeah.
Now I also, because it's all happening on my local system and I don't have a file storage, right? And I don't have a server, where will I store my things that I am actually building, right?
Yeah.
Whatever, let's say my hello.js tomorrow becomes hello.js compiled, transpiled, whatever, right? That needs to be stored somewhere in local. And I can use some sort of storage in the browser for that. So I'm just thinking whether local storage is out of the option, session storage is out of the option because it's too limited, right? So maybe something like IndexedDB could be a good option to save my data.
Okay.
Right? So let me try and draw things like, right? IDB. I'm just going to write it IDB.
Got it.
Right? This is where your data would go. Again, this ends up talking to your main thing, and you do the vice versa as well.
What all data you wanted to save in the IndexedDB, basically?
What I would save is, let's say, whatever is the output of my web worker code in some format that I would want to save, so that it's easy for me to retrieve. It's easy for me to understand what file. So let's say tomorrow, I want to know what all files does this directory have.
Yeah.
Right. And what is the code in that directory, in that file. Right. And if I change a character in that file, where would I go and update? Because I want to run things.
Got it.
Fast,
so
right?
basically you have a file manager. Everything which is stored as a user code is going to be stored in the IndexedDB, and the compiled code or the transpiled code out of that, even which is done by the web worker, probably you also wanted to keep on updating in the IndexedDB, so that your IndexedDB become a main source for all the operations that is going to happen.
Correct. So it's like when you actually do it on a local system, you have your local file directory, file system, and whatever you give as an output after compilation, when you run Webpack or when you run any bundler, right? Whatever comes out in the dist folder or whatever folder you choose to call it, that is also on the file system. Now here we don't have a file system, right? And we don't want to do it on the server file system.
Yeah.
So this is like IndexedDB kind of acts as my proxy file system, which gives me enough storage, which gives me enough room to play with, and I'll store that kind of information over there, obviously in a different format, because it's not a 1:1 file system, so that I kind of understand that flow.
Got it. This is fair enough. So consider example. You definitely, when we are talking iframe, it has a URL. Most of the time you might have seen. If you copy that URL and try to access somewhere else, right? It shows you the application, the web application which you have developed on the left hand side, basically, right? You can open in any of the window.
Correct.
In the same scenario, so consider example, I'm going to make a small modification. You have another window tab, or the window, probably it's not an incognito, and I try to access the same URL. When I say URL, this preview has a URL. The same URL I'm going to access on the new tab.
Okay.
Which is kind of this. Yeah, this is again the URL one which I'm going to access. So what do you think? Like how your communication should be? Are you expecting when a user is actually making a changes, he sees the preview over here, but you haven't actually save those changes on the production, right? Or on the backend, right? In that particular case, every changes are there in your index DB and probably web worker were helping over here. But how do you access the same sort of information and everything on the new URL or the same URL on the new tab altogether, where you don't have any parent which can help you to do a communication?
Interesting. So generally, um, interesting question. Let me think. Okay, so web worker and IDB sort of exist per domain, right? So let's say I open any domain in an iframe, or I open that domain as a separate tab, right? That across that, unless it's incognito, like you said, right? Unless it's incognito where it creates a separate instance and everything. Otherwise, in that same window, same tab or even different tabs, I think IDB web worker would remain the same, right? So you would have that correlation between the tabs and everything. But what I would also do, this is a parallel track in my head that I'm thinking that for all my assets that are required for that URL, maybe a performance enhancement. I'll get back to your previous question also. That as an enhancement, I would like to include service worker here, right?
Okay.
So let's say I use things in an iframe. I download. Let's say I pushed out to the server. Let's say server also exists for everything that I save and I deploy. But where does that asset finally get loaded? And how many times does it get loaded? Every time I reload, does it get reloaded? I wouldn't trust that, right? I would want to either have the browser caching, which is kind of good, but I'll also build service worker on top of it, right? So that I can cache everything that comes from the server, every compiled JavaScript asset that comes from the server, JavaScript, CSS, whatever, and get stored in my service worker. So just to be fair, I'll draw a service worker here, which is caching my, okay, I think I drew it too small. Sorry, I'll just write it out here.
Sure.
Just to be, I think I'm having trouble with. Delete this and then delete this. Yeah. So service worker, I'll just write it here. This is used for caching my JS bundles, right? Or JS static asset. Let's call it static asset, right? So that is there. And why I mentioned this when you asked me that question is one part of it is that when I load it in a separate URL, service worker is accessible to both the areas.
Yeah.
Right. So it is accessible here and it is accessible here. Right. So one part of it is solved that if let's say you are not doing local changes, you were doing changes on the server, let's say it exists today, right? And if you reload, one is you don't have to get any new assets because they're already cached in service worker, right? So that is sorted. The second is, let's say you're doing changes on the local. Okay. You're doing changes on the local because web worker kind of exists per domain, right? Now web worker is an expensive operation that you are doing for that language, correct? But the output is being stored in an IDB, index DB. That index DB is linked to a domain, right? Now that domain is same across the iframe and the URL.
Yeah.
Right. So that is how my interlinking would happen. That let's say I make a change in the code out here, right? This code internally would call the web worker, right? Okay, Muskein has made a change in the JavaScript file, call the web worker to make changes, make it ES5, ES6, whatever, right? However, my code functionality is, web worker goes and makes that change. It tells the system who called it that, okay, here is the output. It says, why don't you put it in the IDB? I have the code in my IDB. Index DB is there. Now, index DB is common. I can hook events onto index DB. Right? I can say, okay, whenever data has changed in my index DB, I want to hook onto it because DB has events, DB has other calls that I can hook onto, right? Any data has changed, give me the output, give me the hook. I'll hook onto that, and that hook will continue to exist even for preview URL and for the main URL, right? Which is open in another tab, and that would get the.
This is interesting. Yeah, this is definitely interesting. One thing just wanted to touch upon. When you wanted to actually save these changes on the server, like right now, whatever save we are doing, whatever changes we are doing, you are ideally latching on the local like index DB, or you are doing a transpilation on the web worker in order to showcase, and everything is happening on the local. What about
Mm.
really some users or client wanted to access that URL in order to see the updated changes?
Right. So I'll come to that. Now this is where it gets all the more interesting, that this is a URL that will persist not just in your local system but also on somebody else's system,
Yeah.
right? Who will be able to access that URL. It's publicly accessible and everybody can view your changes, whatever. Uh, Now let's say, now this is something that I will do with caution, because
Mm-hmm.
this involves making a call to backend, right?
Mm-hmm.
Doing things. So the what I will do is, let's say I'll have a hook. Again, that hook could be file save. That
Mm-hmm.
hook could be pressing a save button somewhere, or that hook could be, let's say, every 1 minute I will make that change.
Yeah.
Howsoever I can leverage that, right?
Mm-hmm.
I will make that hook. Now that hook, what it does is it sends the current status of my app,
Mm-hmm.
whatever it is, to the server. Now I can optimize that flow also. It's not like I want to send the entire snapshot of my app to the backend all the time,
Yeah.
right? Maybe I will introduce some sort of REST API which tells the backend, okay, something has happened. So let's
Mm-hmm.
say tomorrow you add a new file,
Mm-hmm.
I will make a post call. But every time you open the code sandbox, I will make a get call. Every time you make a change, I
Mm-hmm.
will make a patch call. Every time you delete a file, I'll make a delete call.
Got it.
Right.
Yeah.
So
Mm-hmm.
that is the framework that I will have around REST. That okay, I can do that. Right. And when I say I want to patch things,
Mm-hmm.
what do I want to patch? I want to patch this directory,
Mm-hmm.
this file. This is the code,
Got it.
right? And let's say if my code itself is getting too large, I can
Mm-hmm.
introduce, let's say, some sort of delta tomorrow. I can run analytics on top and see, okay, how many changes are happening. But I'm guessing it should be fairly
Yeah.
out of the box solution that
Probably
kind of
when you are
exists.
saying like patch, it can be something like git diff patch sort of, which can be applied on your code.
Sort of, yeah. So
Fair enough.
text diff kind of starts
Fair.
here, ends here, something like that.
Before we
Yeah.
jump into the implementation, just wanted to check on a small thing, how you are going to have a debugging inside your iframe or the preview which you have generated just on the right hand side of your code editor. So like people wanted to see like debug certain things, right? We have a preview, but if we wanted to have a debug or making it more complex further, what if I'm using React and I want some React like debugging over there, right? Where I can see what are the events which are going around. I can actually go and see the component level thing, how we actually do a local development, right? So something that can be given out of box on the remote development also, that will be like a charm, right?
On the remote development also. Okay. By remote development, you mean somebody opening up the server URL also is able to do that, and somebody is opening the code sandbox is also be able to
So
debug
yeah, when I say code
within the
sandbox
sandbox only.
majorly, right? So like mostly
Okay.
development is done on the code sandbox where you are developing and you are
Hmm.
doing a preview, and also you're doing some console.log stuff or like
Hmm.
React dev tool you are using inside out of box, right?
Hmm. Hmm. Right. So there's one thing that I can think of the top of my head. Might sound a bit hacky, but it just comes naturally to me, right?
Mhm.
That let's say I want, when I see Code Sandbox, what they have is they have their own console,
Yeah.
right? Which is whenever you console on the code in that JSTS12 which I wrote over here, whatever
Yeah.
console you write over here comes as a console in that small window,
Yeah.
right? Now what happens is that one is that you can have a API on top of console, right?
Mhm.
Every iframe that you inject,
Yeah.
you write a console overwrite on that. Every time whenever the user writes console, I want the console being passed on to me,
Mhm.
and I will tell it to my parent that okay, this is the console that this guy wrote. Why
Mhm.
don't you build it up in a nice UI and print it out for the end user? It's
Got it.
like a chain
Mhm.
where console is being overridden by people and then it's being passed on to parent and you just show it in a fancy UI, right? That is the idea.
Fair enough.
The other idea of React DevTools, if I understand correctly, React DevTools today gives element picker like it gives to browser gives element picker,
Correct.
right? For HTML elements, and then it gives the props and state and who's the parent, who's the child,
Correct.
bunch of things like that, render
Mhm.
information and everything, right? Now that is where it gets interesting because as far as I remember, React DevTools gets added on as an extension,
Mhm. Yeah.
right? When I open a site, when I open DevTools, it adds off as an extension. But I also remember that React DevTools actually comes up with its own NPM package, so
Okay.
that things like Code Sandbox can sort of leverage that, right?
Fair enough.
So
Yeah.
I am guessing that React DevTools has some API,
Mm-hmm.
right? That lets other people invoke it
Mm-hmm.
and pass it to an iframe or something, and then I can just hook onto it, right?
Fair enough.
Uh, that is my idea, but I'm not sure if that totally is sound enough.
No,
But
no,
I'm guessing
this
that's
is
something.
definitely a fair idea. Like, I just wanted to see the approach in which direction basically you are thinking if you have to leverage certain things. I like the idea, the way
Hmm.
you talked about the console as well. Take a pause. Let's dive into the tech side of thing, what just Muskin talked about. Okay. So we are going to see what are the tech stack basically the CodeSandbox is using and how it is enriching it. Okay, first thing first. Uh, first thing we were talking about the ID. This ID is basically generated using the Monaco editor, which is basically provided by the Microsoft. You can see this is ID. You have a lot of option in terms of changing the theme, basically changing the language, and it has very enriched API support. Okay. Second thing is on the right hand side we can see there is a preview. So how this preview is basically generated. Let's try to do a inspect element. Okay, let's see. We have something called iframe. This iframe is basically in this iframe, using this URL, the application is basically getting rendered. We have something called we can just try hiding this. Okay, this is the frame that we get. There are a couple of more things, which is we can see there is a console, there is a React Dev tool. All these are actually outside of the iframe. Okay, if it is outside the iframe, then how it is getting shared your logs and how it is that allowing the debugging of the content which is present in the outside, you can see the iframe and giving the capability outside to the code sandbox altogether. Okay, to highlight that we have something called React Dev Tool inline. This is a you can say the package basically which is used by the code sandbox and the multiple other, which gives a lot of you can say control in terms of it has enriched API which helps to debug you can say your React application from outside the iframe altogether, and this is developed by the same community which has the React Dev tool. For the console, there is very enriched support which is provided by the console feed. We can see there the multiple IDs which are using its code sandbox, framer, plunger, and so on, right? How it works based on the post messaging. So it does the post messaging between the two frames, which is the iframe and you can say the your main window, that is provided out of the box. Okay, now coming to a couple of more interesting things before we move on. Let's enable this ID, close this. Okay, let's see how this preview is basically working. When we say how the preview is working, if I try to add okay, I wanted to highlight one more thing in terms of the security before we move into the preview. You see there is a console.log document.cookie which I have written. I'm trying to access it. So basically, it is not allowing to get the cookies of the code sandbox because of the security concerns that people are worried about. If we are making the code changes or writing the script on the code sandbox, probably there can be a leak in terms of the security. So that is taken care of because we are having the iframe as in isolation, and there are certain controls and CSPs policies which are added to that. That is taken care of. Now coming to the preview, if say suppose we change certain things over here, like you see there is a code sandbox part 2 and there are certain changes made over there, right? It is reflecting then and there. Let's see, like if it is making some API call in order to get this done. Let's quickly try to navigate to that. So we are right now on the fetch. What I'm going to do, I'm going to make changes over here. Okay, removing the listeners, I might have added some time back. Okay, what we are going to do, I'm going to change these preview. Okay, so you see on the right hand side, these are the changes which are reflected. On the network side, it is just a stats which is being basically tracked. It is nothing to update the data which is user have changed. So this is quite clear over here. But how this preview is basically generated on the right hand side, which is very interesting because you are writing your code on the React. On the same side, the interesting part is we wrote certain things. This is a URL. I'm trying to open this URL on the new tab. On the new tab, you see okay, if I try to make a change again over here, part 2, you see this part 2 is reflected over here. but there is no request which is going to the server in order to say save this data, and automatically without doing any reload or on anything on the new tab, the data is reflecting over here. How this is happening? So let's dive into some interesting fun facts. First thing first, on the if you go into the resources, you can see there are certain like service worker and certain workers which are basically initiated by the code sandbox. Couple of things which are very interested. Monaco linter is basically having its own web worker. There are certain web worker which is related to the Babel transpiler. So your code transpilation is happening on the client itself instead of doing it on the server. So that transpiled code is basically rendered inside this iframe. This is cool, right? So no need to go to the server in order to get your job done. You can use in the off thread, basically apart from the main thread, you can spawn a different thread in order to get your job done. This is how it is happening now. Some interesting thing, how it is able to communicate your data between the one tab to the other tab. So it has service worker basically which can communicate between the multiple tabs of the same domain which is launched over here. Interesting thing, how it is storing the files or the changes that user is doing, right? Where it is actually storing those changes, not in memory, it is in doing something beyond that, and it is very interesting. This is IndexedDB. They are leveraging it very effectively. So wanted to highlight a couple of things over here. Okay, so in the IndexedDB unpack code sandbox, this is the code sandbox. Trying to open the code sandboxes. Try to widen a bit more. Let me quickly expand this. Okay, these are the cool things. Just try to observe what they are trying to do. If I go into the transpiled module, you can see these are the files basically which we are having, which is style.css, index.js, app.js, and package.js. These are the files that we own, right? All the code related to that, like it is a module, this is the exec code which is written, and this is the source code which is the transpiled code. All of these information are stored in the IndexedDB. Whenever we are making these changes, the web workers are basically responsible to transpile, and end of the day it is going to store those information in the IndexedDB. How cool it is, right? Similarly, all the dependencies and everything is stored over here, and you also have a cache. You can go into your cache storage and you can see all the dependencies which are basically like they are effective using the service worker in order to cache their assets. So this is cool, right? So yeah, so keep on exploring more thing, and so many interesting things that Sandbox is doing, and you can always explore. Let's dive into the okay, I think let's dive into more in terms of the implementation. So couple of things I wanted to touch upon the implementation. I think let's first start with the file manager. What I meant by the file manager, so say suppose you have a file explorer altogether where you are seeing the different files, and you can do a lot of operation that we have discussed in the functional requirement, right? You can create, basically you can delete, you can move and list down the file manager. So probably if I have to say, so basically what we will be doing, so it's like your implementation related to file manager. Yeah. So let's pick one at a time. So it's like file manager operation we will be doing. So one is definitely you wanted to list down. Second is I wanted to open any one of the file and wanted to see the details so that I can edit. I can update a file. Yeah. And definitely I can delete or move a file. So these are the some operation that I'm looking for. Say suppose you have to get your API contract done with the backend team in order to have these capability. So what sort of API contract you will be having with your backend?
Right. So what I want to do at the end of the day is, one is finalize on the API. Second, I'll want to help. How do you model a file manager, right? How do you model a file system? Yeah. That is also interesting, that it is not just on the backend side that the file is being actual file manager, right? On the front end side also, you are trying to visualize that file manager, right? Correct. So I think of file manager in the form of a nested view, right? SRC has app has container has app.js, something like that, right? So it genuinely forms a tree, right? Where nodes are being shifted here and there. Sometimes parents are being moved, linking is happening. So that kind of a tree is what I think of file manager as, right? So from a data structure point of view, if I have to write it down, I'll just write it down out here. From a data structure point of view, it is a tree, right? When it is a tree, I mean, let's say now this is where the API comes in. API comes in, I get into a sandbox, so I make a get call to load a sandbox. right? So let's say I'll write the API syntax right away, which becomes, let's say, get, sorry, uh, get is an API. So sandbox, let's say, get, and I'll have a sandbox ID. Let's say Chakde, for example.
Okay.
Right? Chakde is my sandbox, and let me just zoom it. It's becoming. Hanji. Okay. Sandbox is my ID. Now I want the files on it. Tomorrow I can have something else. So this is files on it, or files. I would call it files for now. I'll think of a better name maybe later.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
Maybe I'll call it files for now. And this will give me an output of the tree. Right?
Okay.
And in that tree, every directory will have its own ID. Every an ID and a proper name. Like what do you actually write there? It's an SRC. Right? And what is its children? What is its future nodes? Right? Which is it's connected to. And then every child will also have a parent telling, okay, I'm connected to my parent, right? And that will also have its own ID. And every node, if it's a file, will have code in it. Directory does not have a code. Directory has a linking to the files, but file has a code in it, right? So the content of it, the source code of it. Then I will have bunch of things like, let's say, size. I will have bunch of metadata, right? When was it created? Last time it was updated. File type, extension, everything that is to do with file system will kind of exist there, right? So that's the get call. And now tomorrow, if I want to, let's say, delete the file, right? So I'll expose another API where, let's say, sandbox. I'll have which sandbox are we talking about? Let's say Chakde is the ID, right? I think I'll get rid of get here, Chakde, and I'll have some directory, let's call it ABC.
Sure. Can you also extend the box so that it is visible enough?
Sure. Is it fine now?
Okay. I think you can extend more, bit more.
Yeah.
Perfect. This is good. Yeah.
Right. So just a second. I think I lost. I'm having trouble with this. Choosing this. Okay. Yep. So basically, what I'll do is I'll have sandbox Chakde. What is the directory that I'm getting into, right? I will not go into the directory ABC or something. It will just be the ID, right? Now that ID could be very deep nested inside. Correct. I don't want to pass the entire path, right? There was inside A, there was B inside there was C inside there was D, and then now I'm trying to change the E file. Yeah. Right. So I don't want to pass the entire path and let the backend do it. I just want to be able to backend to be able to figure it out using an ID, the directory ID. So let's say ABC becomes my ID, right? I'm having trouble typing out here. Let me.
Okay, I think you can create another text box and
I'll create another text box. Yeah. So and I'll enlarge this. Okay. So sandbox. Let's say Chakde /ABC ID just to be sure, right? And this is, let's say, create API, right? So create API becomes a post API, right?
Fair enough.
API, and inside I will pass, let's say, a body, which will tell, okay, what is the actual file name, right? What is the source code, the time of creation and client, right? This is the client creation. Then bunch of other things, right? What all information I have, I'll send that. Now becomes, let's say, delete API, wherein I delete a thing. So again, the same thing, sandbox /Chakde /ABC _ID. Then now this is where it gets tricky, right? If I am supporting multiple file deletes, I'll maybe have a body of arrays of files that I'm trying to delete. If I just have one, I will say directory ID. I'll just say whatever is the file ID out here. Let's say file ID, right? And I'm trying to delete it.
Correct.
But if
One
I'm
is
doing multiple,
one you highlighted as a bulk one, right? This is definitely a good one where you wanted to perform a bulk operation, delete all these IDs in a single shot. Can you also think
yeah.
of
So
some challenges that you might feel or face basically when you are deleting some file or multiple file, the impact on some dependencies or somewhere in your code?
yeah, I mean, if let's say you're deleting a file, right?
Yeah.
And that file is being referenced somewhere,
Perfect. Huh?
right? Now that file is being referenced and that was required for you to build that code. Right. Now what happens? Does CodeSandbox as a platform stop building because it will break? What does it do? Right. I think CodeSandbox as a platform does not care about that. Right. At the end, it would give me some functionalities like undo for let's say 10 seconds or 12 seconds or something to make sure I can revert back to my changes. I can also support things like Control Z if I make a unknown change. Right. But I will not stop from building things. Even if it breaks, I'll show that on the preview. So that is something that I will do. File IDs depends on the syntax. I'm not fancy with supporting file IDs as a comma separated IDs. Today, I might go with something like a body or something, or it could just simply be, if I can be very interesting about it, I can give directory ID. If let's say I'm trying to delete all files from the same directory, I'll delete the directory itself, all the directory. All the files are deleted. So things like that I can optimize a little in terms of API. The patch API is where I would, send the new content. So let's say the ID becomes the file ID, whatever, right? And now the body will have a bunch of things like, okay, new compiled code, right? What is the new source code? And time and other metadata, right? And now I might not send the complete new code. Like I said, I might send the diff tomorrow or things like that.
Yeah.
Right. So those are the kind of things that I would do. And this API can also undergo a bit of changes if let's say the URLs are not proper and I can make some changes here and there. I'm passing file ID and directory ID in the same area. So might want to give that information also. Is it a file type? Is it a directory type in the body? So things like that can happen.
Sure, this is fair enough. I think we have also talked about a bit detail in terms of the how the API contracts are going to happen. Just wanted to touch upon two things. Then we are almost done, sort of. One is definitely, say suppose you wanted to extend some capabilities on your ID altogether. You wanted to have some highlighters, code editor. You can say code suggestion sort of thing. So what do you think? What is the approach that you wanted to go with that?
The approach will be, in my head, it is very similar to how we did the code editor. Okay, so code editor, we didn't do it out of the box. So there's no reason to do these things out of the box. These are things like which exist as extensions today, right? So I am thinking that again there must be an API that will let me leverage Code Mirror or Monaco with some extensions that already exist in the market. Not just for VS Code, but also because VS Code also internally uses these things, right? And builds an extension on top of them. I am guessing this would work for normal CodeSandbox as well. Might be some challenges because of environments, right? But I'm guessing it should be possible in that sense.
Fair enough. The last thing which I have, now we have done all sort of deployment. I'm a person who started with my own project. Now I feel like this project is good enough. I wanted to deploy in my own domain, or I wanted to have some place to deploy, right? So like, what is that you have right now? Like how we can basically deploy it to my environment altogether, my infra altogether, or maybe my subdomain. So what thought?
Right. So I have two thoughts. One is like immediate, what can I do? And second is what can I give as a long-term, let's say, product map of sorts, right? So immediate is I can give the user the capability to eject something like Expo does, right? Expo gives out a way to eject. I'm not sure if CodeSandbox does today. You can actually eject your code. The entire file system comes to you. You can run it on your local, do whatever you want with it. Deploy it on Vercel, deploy it on Netlify, whatever. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
you could do hundreds of things. It's like a typical normal application for you,
Yeah.
right? On your local, you can do whatever. The other is within the system, I build integrations,
Mm-hmm.
right? I let you log in, which is
Mm-hmm.
the first thing that we talked about in requirements. And through your login, let's say you log in through GitHub or Gmail or whatever, I can figure out through my integrations, like how GitHub does integrations with Vercel
Mm-hmm.
and Netlify and things like that, where every commit gets deployed to Vercel. Here also something similar could happen. I could do an integration with Vercel if that sort of API kind of exists, because I believe Vercel can be run through CLIs and stuff like that,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So you could integrate that. I am not sure it will be 1:1 with GitHub, because in GitHub we have a concept of commits.
Mm-hmm.
Here, every save is not something I would want to deploy, or
Mm-hmm.
at least not in the unpaid version. I would
Mm-hmm.
go ahead and do it in the pro version or something like that, right? Or deploy it once in every day. Things like that can be a product call, right?
Yeah.
But in the directional sense, I would go with integrations to these platforms, where on the server
Mm-hmm.
I can hook these APIs for Vercel, Netlify, bunch of other things,
Mm-hmm.
and deploy the code that we ended up saving onto those platforms.
Fair enough.
So that is the idea.
Fair enough. I think we have covered a lot, and yeah, we have started with the functional, non-functional requirement. We went into the tech side of thing, and we have literally dive into the lot of stuff in terms of the web worker and the service worker, how we can leverage that, and
Right,
obviously the
right.
implementation side of thing. Yeah, I
Mm.
think we are good now. It was a great discussion with Muskin. I hope you have also learned new things from this episode. So don't forget to like and share this episode with your friends and colleagues. Thank you for watching Chakde System Design and see you in the next episode.